Picture yourself in your childhood home. Let the color of the carpet stand out vividly in your mind. Think about your first pet, the comfort of having that animal by your side, how you felt as a little kid falling asleep in the car with a light breeze on your face on the way home from a road trip, your favorite meal and the way it always tasted better on your birthday. Reminiscing on one's past often invokes a strong variety of emotions. You become happy while recollecting a fond memory, but simultaneously saddened by the notion that that part of your life is over. And while those childhood memories may seem unforgettable and detailed, are they really an accurate portrayal of the events? There are a lot of obvious reasons that your memory may not be completely reliable, but at the end of the day, it is pretty inconsequential if you put a more rosy lens over your personal memories. But what happens when we look at this issue from a sociological perspective? First, let's use a familiar term to define this equally familiar sensation. Nostalgia is a sentimental longing or a wistful affection for the past, typically for a period or place with happy personal associations. It hasn't always been used in that context, however. In 1688, Swiss medical student Johannes Hofer noticed a pattern in his patients who were living far from home. Those who were obsessed with returning to their estranged locations became physically sick. To reflect this phenomenon, he coined the medical term, nostalgia, which comes from the Greek words meaning nostos, meaning homecoming, and algae, meaning pain. And it was seen as a serious medical condition. Now we view this sensation in a completely different way, but do we really understand where it comes from? One study of nostalgia done in 2006 concluded that it is entirely possible that the good feeling associated with nostalgia is derived not from the actual content of the memory, but the response our brain has to recalling specific events. As the study puts it, people may interpret that burst of positive emotion as evidence that the remembered events were unique in their goodness, even when those events were not especially pleasurable at the time they were experienced. Understanding the individual's experience of nostalgia is imperative to confronting the overarching societal experience. Collective nostalgia is a shared longing for the past or what society once was. It's likely you've heard at least one of these phrases in conversation. The world these days, it was a different time then, we're more divided than ever. Back in my day, people were more sensible. They're harmless, common expressions, yet they convey one of the biggest claims of our society. The world is getting progressively worse, and there's nothing we can do to stop it. Is this notion that humanity is becoming continually more depraved based on reality and statistics, or misdirected nostalgia? The problem with this conviction that the past was better is that people often don't take into account how memory gets distorted over time. Your selected memory will fixate on the good aspects of a time period, and while that may seem trivial, it leads some people to conclude that we have not progressed at all, or to ignore the distressing things that go hand in hand with the past. It is also easy to believe the past is superior if you wouldn't have been impacted by its negative aspects. For example, people who aren't women or minorities may more readily accept the narrative that life was better in the past because it might have been for them. This is why, in my opinion, it is so important to understand history through the eyes of individuals, and to really see things from different perspectives. Of course, while there are aspects of life that were objectively better in the past, there are also so many things, and like medical advances, technological advances, and social justice issues, or simply convenience that have improved immensely. I would argue that everything is a trade-off, and while we make progress in one area, at the same time, technology creates new problems, and therefore, things are always changing, but not necessarily becoming better or worse overall. Also, throughout history, people have always said the past was better. One of my favorite movies illustrates this idea perfectly.
What are you talking about?
We should stay here. It's the start of La Belle Époque. It's the greatest, most beautiful era Paris has ever known.
Yeah, but what about the 20s and the Charleston and the Fitzgeralds and the Hemingways? I mean, I love those guys.
Well, it's the present. It's dull.
Dull? It's not my present. I'm from 2010.
What do you mean?
I dropped in on you the same way we're dropping in on the 1890s.
You did?
I was trying to escape my present the same way you're trying to escape yours to a golden age.
Surely you don't think the 20s are a golden age?
Yeah, to me they are.
But I'm from the 20s and I'm telling you the golden age is La Belle Époque.
I mean, and look at these guys. I mean, to them, their golden age was the Renaissance. They'd rather, they'd trade Belle Epoque to be painting alongside Titian and Michelangelo. And those guys probably imagined life was a lot better when Kubla Khan was around. I'm having an insight.
In every era, some will think that there was a golden age that was better, but during that so-called golden era, people had the same longing for a time gone by. It's not a matter of reason, but a matter of patterned sociological behavior. Americans' perception regarding crime rate is overwhelmingly pessimistic. Americans tend to believe that crime rate is up nationally. Now you may say, it isn't pessimistic if it's true. Well, let's look at some statistics, shall we? The two primary sources of government crime statistics reflect that the violent crime rate fell 49% between 1993 and 2019. The property crime rate also fell 55%. So if the statistics regarding the progress versus decline of the country don't match up with the perception most people have, the next logical question is, where did that perception come from? I'm sure it would be a satisfying answer to say it's the fault of the media, and this is partly true, but a topic this nuanced can never have a root that simple. The reality has a lot more to do with cognitive bias and our refusal as a society to accept progress. No matter how aware you think you are of your psychological processes, I can say with complete certainty that everyone in this room has fallen prey to a phenomenon called rosy retrospection. Rosy retrospection refers to the tendency people have of judging the past disproportionately more positively than they judge the present. This is not an inherently bad bias. In fact, it has a strong hold on us for a reason. If you accurately recalled every aspect of your past, you'd go insane. The act of simplifying or exaggerating memories serves to free up more space to store long-term memories. The real danger is being unaware that we often revert to this bias when thinking about the past. Failure to recognize that our brains don't always remember everything accurately can lead to blind trust in our own memories, which isn't helpful considering how they are easily influenced. Who exactly is influencing the way we view the present in comparison to the past? Here's the part where you can place the blame on the media, the news, etc. But even now, you don't actually have the right to fault those industries, because it still circles back to how we're wired. Reporters and politicians have the same bias that you do. They just often have more of an understanding of how to use it to their advantage. When trying to inspire a group of people, it is much more effective to frame a situation as dire if you want action to be taken immediately. Political pundits and social justice advocates are aware of this, and they know that oftentimes a story or a cause must be sensationalized in order for society at large to care about it. Let's discuss why society tends to focus on the negative. First of all, it's simply because it's reflected in the news more. The concept of reporting on things that happen instead of things that don't happen seems fairly basic. For example, progress can often look like a lack of something bad, which is more passive than an actively bad scenario. We don't continually learn about how many crimes were not committed, after all. What we are constantly flooded with is the bad that is actively happening while the passive piece gets ignored. The second reason is centered around loss aversion, the psychological principle that, on average, losses hurt twice as much as gains feel good. Therefore, bad emotions, bad feedback, and bad news create more of a neurological impact than their positive counterparts. Technology also heavily influences our perceptions. The dialogue surrounding technology and how it has affected our society permeates much of daily conversation. We talk about how social media impacts self-image, how being so connected on the internet transforms our brains, and how too much screen time is damaging. However, in my personal opinion, we aren't discussing how technology makes us more aware of criminal activity. The internet is obviously an extremely useful tool that we didn't have in the past. Having this amount of knowledge at our fingertips gives us the potential to be more aware and therefore more productive. However, we must grasp the reality that these issues were brought to light instead of brought to fruition in the 21st century, in order to finally realize that, while yes, it may seem like the world is becoming more evil, that notion doesn't take into account the fact that we weren't collecting nearly the amount of data 30 years ago that we are now. Just because people allowed their children to wander the streets in the good old days doesn't mean the dangers weren't there, the information just wasn't as accessible. Ignorance is bliss has never been a more applicable saying. What happens when people allow their cynical perception of the present moment to shape their outlook for the future, and sometimes even change their way they view other people? Declinism is the belief that a particular country, society, or institution is in a state of significant and possibly irreversible decline. We see this persistently in American politics. As Jeremy Adelman, professor of history at Princeton University, put it, the idea of decline is the one thing the extremes of left and right agree upon. In his paper, Why the Idea that the World is in Terminal Decline is So Dangerous, Adelman explains that when it comes to politics, people prefer an all-or-nothing mentality over a less dramatic solution. For, quote, "For revolutionaries, what awaits is a utopian alternative. For reactionaries, what lies in wait is dystopia," unquote. But I'm sure you still maintain that while this could be true for others, your political ideologies could never be influenced by cognitive bias. You are immune to sociological patterns, and all your beliefs are simply based in logic and reason. The truth is, although it may be a scary thought, none of us can ever untether ourselves completely from our biases. Perception is a muddled amalgamation of our past experiences, worldview, external influences, and even how we feel in that very moment. This doesn't mean we can never be accurate or reasonable, but it does mean that the more we question our original perception of things, especially the past, we will catch our own biases and become more precise in how we view the world. And it is important to be vigilant about our biases, because declinism can quickly morph into a fatalistic attitude. If the world is becoming exponentially worse in every way, why would I do anything to try to stop it? It's inevitable. Progress isn't inevitable, but neither is decline. We must fight for progress day in and day out, and the mindset that will keep us moving forward isn't yearning for the past while having no hope in the future, but learning from our past mistakes and being aware of the advances we have already made and will continue to build upon. The Bible explicitly states that there is a time for everything. We are meant to accept the time God has placed us in and do the best we can to glorify Him. Whether that means accepting a difficult chapter of our own individual lives or the decade we were born in. I'm not saying the world is better or worse in any capacity than it has been in the past. I am saying that when it comes to either blind optimism versus believing the present moment is undeniably worse and convincing yourself it will get progressively worse, either extreme can lead to complacency, and here's why. Believing things are 100% better than before leads you to think the work is done. And believing things are terrible and beyond repair makes you think the work isn't worth doing in the first place. In actuality, each time period has its advantages and disadvantages. It is worth recognizing your own biases, as well as noticing the influences at work in your environment that are trying to manipulate your memory and your attitude toward the current moment. Moving into the future with this knowledge of how your perceptions can be skewed will give you balance and the ability to see the time you're living in for what it is, and to see your past and even history as a whole in a more realistic light. Even if your memory isn't as rosy as when you were unaware of these biases, it is always freeing to have a propensity to seek truth, even when that truth is nuanced. In the long run, the most unpleasant truth is a safer companion than a pleasant false one. Theodore Roosevelt. Thank you.
In class, your great reasoning approach to the topic, and it reminds me of some of the discussions we had on the optimism bias.
Mm-hmm.
In a very brief, 10 words or less, what was your takeaway?
Mr. Lindemann warned us you'd ask this question. I thought about it. I would probably say perception is rarely reality.
Interesting. Well, and what I really appreciated was your diving into the data. You remember how many times we talked about that. Go through data. Difficult to do. What's accurate, what's not. Data, some data is data, right? It's not like but with that, it doesn't surprise me. You may not know. I referred to Piper as our resident sociologist over the years, because this is your thing, right? Looking at mind and behavior. Do you find, final question, do you find biases starting to come into your thinking?
Yeah, I do, and I have noticed it even more now that I've been researching this. Mm-hmm. I'll think one thing and then I try to look at it from the perspective of other people, or even just the way I was raised, because everything that you've ever done or people have said to you goes into how you view the world. And of course you can't change that, but that's kind of the point, is to recognize it and realize, well, maybe I will dwell on this longer than just saying what I feel in that moment. And I think it helps a lot.
The word dwell. Mm-hmm. The Bible says meditate, thinking about it. Good, excellent.
I have something. So when you talked about like escaping the present, or like that was your clip, and judging the past in favor over the present. The idea of like that negativity that we have naturally, the negativity bias that we have. How do you, and you being a senior right now, and I'm wondering maybe like it's especially relevant to you.
Yeah.
Like, how do you overcome that? And I have a quote, because Mr. Lindemann does it. So I have a quote from him. He said, he's been saying this the last couple of years, these are the good old days. These are like right now we're in the good old days. So how would you do that? As a Christian or just as a person?
I would say it kind of goes along with just, you can't, I've heard a quote like this before, but you can't necessarily control your first thought or your first saying, but you can control what you do after that. So the biases aren't really our fault, but we can control how we train ourselves to think about things. So I have noticed that going into the future, I'm very nervous and sometimes like, I just want to be a kid again, you know? But when I think about it more, it's so easy to make it seem like the past was better because I'm not in it anymore. And it's easy to make the future seem scarier than it really will be because I'm not in it. So just kind of grounding myself or anyone into right now and thinking, well, why do I even feel that way? And then a lot of times it's underlying problems, you know, that you're worried about. It's not actually that either of those things are true.
It's good. So it's just going back to even to Emma's about understanding what's actually going on and taking input from the facts, being God being one.
Mr. Hickok, that's the question I was going to ask.
And here I was going to do a follow-on to yours. Thank you. I just wanted to bring up a thought. Epictetus was a Greek philosopher 2,000 years ago. And he said it wasn't the event that took place that was really that had the most profound impact, but it was our opinion of the event. And so I'm seeing sort of that a taint of that in what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's how we respond or think or frame it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Just like it's not always what you say, but how you say something. People don't like nuance and gray areas, but that's what most of life is. So, yeah.
I wanted to say one other thing too. So that's like you're keeping that balance of how you deal with it, what it is, and not being pushed off one the extreme or the other, maybe in your view. But as a Christian, you know, this whole idea of terminal decline that you mentioned, like, because the Bible does say things are going to get worse and stuff, and you know, like the book of Revelation is at the end, and, and there's a lot of bad stuff, or it talks about, you know, that idea in general. What do you recommend for Christians in their worldview? How do you keep from a terminal decline mentality and still like know that things maybe are actually, the facts are that they are getting bad in a certain locality or in general? Yeah.
And I would say that I did think about Revelation and you asking that question when I was writing this and struggling with how to think about that, but you just have to think about it like things can get worse or better objectively, of course. It's not that like, oh, the present moment is perfect and the past was bad. That's not really the point I'm making, but the Bible does say that, so I agree, but I'm just saying you have to not let it become fatalism, like I was saying, you know, because even biblically, I feel like some people can fall into that where they're just focusing on Revelation, not focusing on living a Christian life, a fulfilling Christian life right now. Yeah. And so while I do think it's important to study what's going to happen and the things in the future, I think, you know, I don't know the exact verse, but the Bible also does say to worry about tomorrow, and not dwell on it today. So just recognizing that things will always be getting better and things will always be getting worse, but not necessarily all at once.
Yeah, that's good.